Hi, thank you very much. I'm going to wander in part because I'm missing part of the room over here. So thanks for hanging in there. It's tough to be the last panel before the fun really starts, and we have Richard and then is there going to be booze, Sarah? Okay, because I was fantasizing. Tsakani is calling me Oprah here, but actually I thought that the key to my session would be to be like the Graham Norton show, where everybody drinks a lot and then comes out with their drinks and continues drinking through the panel. But unfortunately, donor rules prevent that. So I want to make a point and then introduce the panel and let them do all the hard work. But last is not least, and evidence use begins at the beginning. And in listening to the presentations that went before, there were always the comments about the key elements of engagement that had to be present. And that conversation started at design stage, at setting the questions, and then through implementation. And so this part of it is the continuation of what is an iterative cycle. That if we want evidence to be used, first we have to make sure it's useful. And then we do know certain things that help promote it as it's being produced and then afterwards. And what we have here is a panel of people who think about this, and both in practical terms in their work, but also at the level of how they can be catalysts and support, especially those of us who are on the funding side, to help and support others to advocate for the use of evidence and to help us see that we can improve the availability, accessibility, and appropriate use of evidence in decision making that actually helps poor people improve their lives, which is, of course, 3IE's goal. So the way this is going to run is that each of the panelists is going to make a short overview presentation about themselves and their work so that you can understand where they're coming from. And then we're going to, through questioning each other, because you're supposed to talk amongst yourselves and challenge each other, and bringing the audience in, we will spend most of the session really more interactively going back and forth. Just before I get started, so I'm looking for, I have plants, all right? I am not above planting people in the audience, but I'm not sure that they have actually come as promised. So is Harlan here from ID Insight? Yes. Okay, now, yes. And Heidi? Okay, so Heidi's here from IPA. And excellent because they're also implementing on the ground and can bring even more perspectives. So I'd like to introduce, Gonzalo's going to go first. I'll just go alphabetically, but Gonzalo Hernandez Licona is a long-standing and very valued member of sort of a founding member of 3IE. And so we rely on his wisdom as and insights as Executive Secretary of CONEVAL, which the English translation is National Council for the Evaluation of Social Development in Mexico. So we're hoping that he can give a perspective on what it's like to be responsible at the national level for evaluation, and then hopefully seeing how that information is used. And then we're going to hear from Norma. We're going alphabetically. Norma Altshuler, who's very graciously stepped in at the last moment because Kamran Durrani from DFID couldn't be here. It does turn out, and I told him I had to say this because it relates to evidence use and being able to promote it. It's election season in the UK, and government staff are not allowed to speak publicly about evidence. Or anything else without formal permission. And he did try his best and was turned down. I will let you all take that as you wish. And Norma is with us from the Hewlett Foundation. And then Silvia Diazgranados Ferrans, I hope I got that right, from the International Rescue Committee, has already had an introduction from the previous panel, and we'll be talking about what IRC is doing to promote evidence use, the type of evidence in IRC, and how they're working to get their evidence used in the institution. And Tsakani Ngomane, my dear friend from the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in the Office of the Presidency in South Africa, who is a specialist in rural development and who has really blazed the trail in understanding how groups come together and to get evidence used and influence policy, who has to be at the table and what that looks like. So without further ado, Gonzalo, I think you've got a few slides.
So, well, thank you very much, Beryl, for the invitation. Thank you very much for, of course, for 3IE and for all of you to stay the whole day. A month ago, I was invited to the IDB, to a very technical panel about impact evaluation. And I was there because we do and we use impact evaluations. And when I started supporting the idea of that impact evaluations should be used for public policy purposes, most of the audience said, well, why is that? I mean, we are here, we are scientists, we are trying to publish, we are doing a very good effort, so, I mean, that's all right. So I was like a bit odd in a very odd audience. Perhaps I was not the right person to be invited there. But here, I really hope that you thought about inviting me very well, because when you are dealing, when you are producing impact evaluations, in order to improve public policy in a country, in order to improve accountability in a country, therefore the use is perhaps the most important element. And therefore, in the case of Mexico, we have set up this monitoring and evaluation system by law. And from the very beginning, we had in mind, how are we going to use impact evaluations in an atmosphere with policymakers who don't think about using evidence very often? So we built this monitoring and evaluation system, but it is not true that using that is straightforward. Basically because policymakers have many other things in their minds. So when the president wakes up, when the Minister of Social Development wakes up every morning, they don't say, how I'm going to help people today. The first thing they have in mind is the next election or the next position they want to be in the future. That is the main interest in the morning. Then they talk about other things. So one important element for us that we came from academia at the beginning is, how can we match the findings we have, how can we match the evidence we have to those incentives they have? Because if we don't match, and I think that's so far over the past 10 years, I think that element is the most important element I found in order for policymakers to use evidence. When we match what we have with their political incentives. Because it would be very naive to think that we have been producing an extraordinary document with the best techniques and the ultimate techniques, and perhaps the Nobel Prize in Economics was helping us. And if we just tell the Minister of Social Development, look, this paper was done by James Heckman, they will go, oh, yeah, really? I'm going to use it tomorrow. That doesn't work this way. If we link what we have with their incentives, and let me give you an example, which perhaps I mentioned it to some of you. When my son was 9, 10 years old, we keep telling him to brush his teeth. And we produce a lot of evidence in order to convince him. Look at your teeth if you don't brush your teeth. Your mouth is going to smell not very nice. A lot of evidence. And he was like, yeah, right, sir. Yeah, sure. We couldn't make it. Until at 11 years old, he discovered girls. And he discovered one specific girl. And then after some weeks, he went to me and said, well, so what did you say about this teeth thing? Well, I mean, and then as long as there was a match between his incentives and my evidence, he was able to use it. So I hope at the end of the later, I'm going to explain you a very concrete example of how we are doing that. I'm just going to finish saying, I understand that it's very difficult to measure using evidence, but we have to do it. We really have to work in trying to convince people, taxpayers, that the resources we are paying in doing evaluation is being used to improve public policy. If we don't convince taxpayers that that is happening, I think that in very few years we won't be able to have as many resources for evaluations. Because if we only said to taxpayers, look, last year I produced 55 impact evaluations, they say, well, that's so what? So why don't you give the money directly to the poor? If you say, well, with this 50-21 evaluation, we were able to change policy in this way so many times, I think that's have more possibilities to have resources in the future. So I'm stop here, and then I'll let Flora. Thank you very much.
So most of the other panelists come from institutions that are doing really interesting and terrific work and are going to tell you about their institutions. I'm going to tell you about something much more interesting than talking about my own home institution, which is to tell you about some of the organizations we support and our general strategy. I'm talking about some things other than evaluation, because part of what we hope is that use and usability can happen by different people involved in data and evidence learning from each other. So what can the impact evaluation community learn from think tanks? What can the big data revolution learn from the impact evaluation community? And would love to, part of our goal is building a field and community in useful, actionable ways. So would love to foster any connections that sound relevant to your work that come out of this. So broadly, the goal of my portfolio at the Hewlett Foundation is that governments pay attention to data and evidence at every stage of the policymaking process. When you're setting national priorities, sure helps to have accurate, timely, reliable information about what their problems are and what they are not. When you're designing programs, helpful to understand the details of problems and what doesn't and what has and hasn't worked in other contexts and what might apply, how some of those lessons might apply to yours. And of course, the importance of having really good monitoring systems and impact evaluations when appropriate to refine ongoing decision making. There's some really interesting opportunities specifically about use that we found in a couple different silos that I think there's some potential for some really exciting dialogue about how they can be helpful to impact evaluations. Our broad strategy is not about improve this specific policy in this specific moment, but about how can we have systems and institutions, especially African institutions, most of our work is in East and West Africa, that will drive use and provide good evidence over time. So one area we work in is think tanks. We support a lot of think tanks in Africa on the theory that they're well positioned to figure out what priorities governments actually care about and then to drive use in those contexts. There's also some really interesting work around the data revolution. So we have all of these new techniques around how to gather data quickly, cheaply, more fast, a lot of political excitement. How do we make sure that's actually useful in decision making? So for example, the Statistical Office of Ghana came to us a few months ago and said that they were sick of producing information and statistics that other people in their government weren't using as much as they could to improve decision making. One of our other grantees helped them have an international workshop where they were able to get a lot of political excitement. The vice president and his 35-person police band were talking about how important it is to have reliable data to inform national priorities and how they could specifically work with other parts of the Ghanaian government to do that. So maybe some targeted technical assistance, some targeted help at political momentum can help data that is already being produced not only be more reliable, but be actually used and have political momentum behind that. Of course, we do work in impact evaluation, including being really proud to support 3IE and having more timely, relevant information, and also thinking about the systems and enabling environment. And we're also really interested in building a field of conversations around this. So the other panel mentioned technology developments and innovations. Many of these are useful both in statistics work and in impact evaluation. What can we do to foster conversations and collaborations around making sure that those technological innovations exist but are usable? What can the impact evaluation community learn from the momentum that has come in around the political use of big data? What can the think tank community learn from the impact evaluation community about thinking hard about your theory of change? So again, really excited to hear, I know this is going to be a dialogue, what kinds of communities of practice would be useful and actionable for you.
Hi, so I'm Silvia Diazgranados from the International Rescue Committee. My colleague Kate had already mentioned that the International Rescue Committee is an organization that responds to the world's worst humanitarian crisis. We work in more than 30 countries around the world, all countries that have been experiencing some sort of conflict or crisis. And we try to, in our 5-year strategic plan, our aim is to make the organization outcomes driven, meaning that all of our programs are trying to promote meaningful changes in the lives of the populations that we serve. So instead of trying to, for example, measure the types of which we of course also measure the types of activities that we're conducting. We're trying to capture the types of changes. For example, how much, an intervention, how much is it increasing the learning of students? The strategic plan is also trying to make the organization evidence-based, and that's where I'm going to try to talk more in depth. And it's also trying to generate evidence, so about what works in context of crisis and conflict. So one of the challenges that we experience is that despite the fact that there are many rigorous studies in the world, very, very, very few, as you know, have been conducted in context of conflict and crisis. And so the International Rescue Committee has a very good plan developed to try to generate evidence about what works and how things work and for whom things work, and also trying to develop valid measures to apply in context of crisis and conflict. We have some research priorities that are very important for us in this context: education in emergency, preventing family violence, reducing under 5 mortality, and cash relief in emergency. So those are the areas where we really, really try to generate evidence. Those are the areas of our research priorities. And one of the things that we try to do, which I'd like to actually, I'm going to show you some tool that we have developed, which really, it's very important for us because we're an evidence-based organization. We try to make the evidence accessible for all of the people and the programs that we work. And so we have developed what we call this is an online tool that is available. It's of public use for everybody, so you can explore it later. It's pretty fascinating. It's a tool where we really try to make the evidence accessible for the different groups of people. We call it the Outcomes and Evidence Framework. So you can see here that the International Rescue Committee really tries to, there's some very big outcomes that we try to promote: economic well-being, and there's some sub-outcomes for that: power, education, health, and safety. So for each one of these, we have created a very interesting tool that, for example, you can explore here. And so what you see is that this tool has identified the different theories of change that will lead to the outcomes that we want. And we have actually created links to the evidence that supports those things. And so we have, for example, here the large outcome is, for example, that's in the one that I chose for, there are different outcomes for education. So just to give you an example, for example, for the population of 6 to 14-year-olds, the larger outcome that we want to reach is that they have the literacy, numeracy, and social-emotional skills according to their levels of development. And so that's the outcome we want to reach. And then we have identified here in the theories of change the different sub-outcomes, the different things that would need to happen for us to be able to facilitate those that thing. And so, for example, it is one of the things that needs to happen is that children are healthy during the school age years, that teachers deliver quality instruction in reading, math, and SEL, social emotional development to all girls and boys, that mothers, fathers, caregivers communicate with and practice social emotional skills, literacy, and numeracy skills with their children, that girls and boys enroll in and attend safe, functioning, and responsive education services, and that schools are safe, caring, and predictable. And for each one of these, we also have identified the specific steps or the specific things that need to happen, like all of them need to happen for us to be able to successfully change the outcomes of children. Now, what you see here is that, so that's a theory of change, is like we have identified the outcomes we really want to target and the things that need to happen for us to be able to change those outcomes. But we also have identified, we have this specific tool has linked the interventions and the evidence, the specific evidence that is available that can promote those outcomes. And so, for example, here we know that to promote this specific thing, we have evidence from 91. And in this case, the only studies that we link are systematic reviews. So there's 91 systematic reviews that are providing evidence about how to change this specific outcome. And so here, for example, you can see for each one of these, you can see, for example, whether there's positive evidence, promising evidence, mixed evidence, no evidence whatsoever, and so you can see here the specific studies where they were conducted, in which countries. We try to provide as much contextual information about the populations in which the evidence exists, and they're linked to the citations of the specific studies, and so these, and so for each one of these. You can also find the longer description of the. You can find the links to the studies. You can find whether the evidence is positive, is negative, and this is a tool that we at the International Rescue Committee try to use at every level of programming. And so, for example, from the very first moment in which we are going to design an intervention, we sit down in a design workshop, and we have the designers, we have the teams from the countries, we have the researchers, and we all look at the theories of change and identify in a specific context what are the obstacles. So, for example, we can find that we can identify that the mothers and fathers and caregivers monitor and hold teachers accountable. So we may find that in a specific context that's not happening, and then we can look at what are the interventions, what is the evidence that exists to try to change those behaviors in a meaningful way, and we can then propose how to address those things at the level of program design. So it's a way in which we try to translate the evidence that exists into how we're trying to take action to make the life of people in context, children and youth and adults in settings of conflict and crisis more effective. So,
good evening. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. In the evenings in Africa, where I come from, communities or families like telling stories. So storytelling is one of the greatest mode of communicating effectively, especially amongst Black communities. I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you a story of a young girl who grew up in apartheid South Africa in rural settings. This particular girl watched how her parents, particularly the mother in the household, was able to have a significant impact on the livelihood of the family by producing food under hard conditions, vegetable gardens, and things like that, using that, the produce, to actually impact the quality of life of the neighbors in that community. And that girl was brilliant in school, always top of the class and all that. So the dream for the parents was for the girl to be a doctor in medicine or something like that, but not to go through the hardships of toiling the soil and all that. You know that, I'm sure that's the dream of most impoverished communities and households. But the evidence of what toiling the soil could do in transforming lives kind of stuck in this girl's mind, and she went to school disowned by the parents when she refused to go to a medical school and choosing to go for agriculture and community development training and things like that. Upon completing the training program, she went as a field practitioner, this girl, on the field, working with women's groups, youth groups, farming communities, to try make a difference, help them access resources and all that, and moved up the hierarchy to a point of influencing policy and advisory services and the agricultural sector. However, there was something significantly lacking, I hear, that this girl realized that, you know, even though there were initiatives and interest from individuals and communities and policymakers to try improve their lot, you understand me, there was something missing. You know, there was a dearth of information, credible information, relevant information and research from the academic institutions. So, you know, being an activist that she was, went to the universities to try influence change from that point. Probably when we engage with the academic community, develop programs at that level, we'll be able to respond to the real needs of the communities. I heard she was interviewed after some years. I think this was, she did 15 years doing the practitioner work, 5-6 years in the academic community, and to her disappointment found the scholars in the academic institutions took so much pride in pursuing what we call self-serving research that was not really addressing the needs of society overall or assisting government to turn around to achieve the desired outcomes. Then South Africa, you know, in democracy, we embraced all kinds of innovations and learning, I think, from colleagues in Mexico and other places. The outcomes approach was introduced. There was a government-wide framework as well that legalized or institutionalized the need for using evidence to inform policy. Hearing of that, then there was a national development plan, which is a unique achievement in that country. And the girl thought, maybe let's go into that level and engage with the National Development Plan to address key priorities around rural development, agriculture, education, and all that. 5 years into that system, the girl realized the significant achievement at the highest level of government in terms of conducting evaluations, trying to address the priorities of food security, generating income, increasing employment, and all that, in terms of policy framework. But still, if you read documents and assess performance of South Africa overall, you see unemployment is increasing. Today, as I speak, I think it's around 26.5%, worse off in rural areas, affecting mostly the youth and African youth. Poverty is deepening. There's a general increase in livelihoods, but the poverty, pockets of poverty in rural areas, in townships, in informal settlements, is deepening. Food security, there are challenges. Land reform, today is we're celebrating independence. The president of that country just announced we're not achieving anything on land reform 22 years into democracy. And that means we need to consider expropriation, land without compensation, expropriating of land without compensation. That this is today, yeah? And the girl thinks, probably there's something missing. With all this work, the prioritization of key delivery areas, the massive evaluations that have been conducted that shows the gaps and areas of improvement in the system, and still poverty is deepening. Unemployment is on the rise. What is happening? So I did some search to establish who is this girl, and that is me, yeah? You can guess, yeah? And how many evaluations to date on the second wave? I think the number is 93, right? Yeah?
Total evaluations? 59.
59. On the second wave, on the second call, about 93 at provincial level.
Oh, there's 93 provinces, yeah.
That's a big number. Still, poverty is deepening. Yeah? Unemployment is on the rise. Activists are on the streets in South Africa calling for change. It's an election year. Land reform is still the tool that is being used politically for political expediency. What is wrong? Yeah? What is wrong? I accepted the opportunity to engage in this session to provide some insights in terms of what is wrong in South Africa. Why is the evidence, massive evidence that is there? The diagnostic work that was done to inform our National Development Plan pointed to areas of weakness. The evaluations point to areas of weakness, but still something is wrong. And this is what I want to share with you in the second round of this panel. Thank you.
I had wanted to have a segue back to Gonzalo, and you've provided the perfect one. That in the sense of Gonzalo, you had mentioned the importance of matching incentives as promoting use. So, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm hearing Tsakani's, beautiful story and troubling story at the same time, and saying, what's the misalignment? Of course, she's hinted at a few things, and perhaps you can also address the role of politics in aligning incentives and not. And we can start to build out the various factors, because one of the things about evidence use is that it's a complex and oftentimes uncontrollable constellation of factors that come together that can be the basis of driving forward use, that can make the difference. So, Gonzalo, over to you to, I think, build on that and of course, some incentives, take it however you can, and then we'll keep going and bring others in.
Yeah, thank you. So three examples about incentives. If someone can help me with the presentation, so one element there. The first element that we introduced together with our friends from South Africa is because our monitoring and evaluation system came by law. It's like a mandatory thing to have evaluations. We were able to produce a follow-up mechanism in which we ask programs and institutions that from the evaluation which is just finished, they have to pick up the most important elements to improvement, and they have to have public an improvement plan. So every year, the program should have an improvement plan coming from the evaluation process. That is not mandatory. What is not mandatory is that they have to do something, because there's a big debate is, do we make mandatory the information from the evaluation? I think we don't have to do it, because we have to be quite humble in the terms of evaluation and say, well, those who take decisions are policymakers. The people elected policymakers. The people didn't elect CONEVAL. We are just technicals who can help to take better decisions. But at least if they don't do anything about it, we have to show to the public that they were not able to produce an improvement plan. So every program has an improvement plan. If it's not up there, the media, I know the media are going to get them. So one incentive there is just that the media constantly say, well, these 3-4 programs did not put an improvement plan public. That's one incentive. And because of that, and then we track the changes. And this is the number of changes done in public policy and the number of uses of these evaluations over the past almost 9 years at CONEVAL. So this is a very important indicator for us. Our most important results indicator for us is the number of changes that we track from the evaluation and the evidence method. Even that programs are not compulsory to do any changes. They can do that. If they don't do that, we just publish that they didn't do anything, but they don't go to jail. We don't do anything more than that. So this is one piece of incentive that shows you that if you are able to conduct an M&E system within a country with certain incentives, you can end up actually using what is happening in terms of evaluation. And then we are able to put findings which modified public policy or which strengthened institutional capacity on in terms of accountability. The 3 types of changes and uses of the evaluation findings. And the second example I want to make, and then we selected in every year the changes done in changing activities or modifying budget or redesign programs or aggregate or reallocate programs or programs who are eliminated, which are not that much, but we have done some elimination of problems or programs due to the evaluation. But let me give you just the most interesting linkage between evidence and political incentives. CONEVAL measures poverty in a multidimensional way. And for the very first time in the Mexican history, we have poverty figures by state and a national level. And for the very first time, the government is not able to change those figures according to the thoughts. For the very first time in the history of Mexico. Secondly, policymakers, from the president to the governors, they know that if poverty goes up in their states, they look bad. The media just hits them. They want to be presidents, they want to be next governors, they want to be, and that element is not very good for them. Therefore, the surprising thing over the past 5 years is that governments knock at our door and says, well, I understand that we are measuring poverty this way, and we want to reduce poverty according to the way you measure it. Our measurement includes income, education, health, social security, housing, and food access. And therefore, what is happening, surprisingly, is that instead of CONEVAL knocking at the door saying, well, I have this evaluation saying that these programs are not working or are working in terms of poverty, are the governors the one who's knocking at the door saying, well, can you let us know from your evaluations which are the most important programs to reduce poverty in every dimension? So that is a very good example when you link a political incentive with evidence. I don't know if it's going to last a lot of time. I don't know if it's going to keep this pace for a long time. But the surprising thing and the interesting thing is that these guys, perhaps they don't care much about people. Let's say. They care about their future. And their future partly depends on the poverty figures, which they cannot change as before, only if they work through public policy. So that's a very interesting example when you have one single indicator which is very powerful in the media and is very sensitive from a political point of view, and then that leads you to the demand for evaluations for single programs.
Norma had brought up an important role that Hewlett is trying to make that feeds into some of the slides that we just saw too, which is the importance of linking actors. But I'd like to surface something about that first to kind of situate it, in that I think that there's a bias sometimes, I'll just generalize, what the heck, that evidence use is privileged to, it matters most if we're influencing those with defined formal power. And that, you know, it's evidence-informed policy making. That this policy word is a basket almost, but pretty much it's a synonym for those who have power. But I noticed from Gonzalo's slide and from what Norma said about how bringing think tanks in, and others have mentioned civil society, and the media is coming up. And I'd like us to really look at that a bit, that you're tracking use by civil society, you're using the media, which of course, in some countries you cannot go to the media. I think South Africa actually is much more problematic, the role of the media, and we can hear more about that. I think it's great when you can do it. I'm not saying that it's not important. It's that not every country context permits it, you know, so you're in a privileged position. But I think in taking it forward, Norma, to relate it to this work on linking actors and how that might improve evidence use, and tell us about in what ways. And then I'm going to hold everybody accountable, one, not to conflate to the policy thing, but also use. And we'll get back to that. But in hearing this story about CONEVAL, what is use? What are we measuring? And what wasn't on that list? IRC looks at use by the communities. Thomas was saying the beneficiaries, those affected by the interventions. And are we tracking that? And 3IE is in the same basket. You know, we're right there with you, being blind and looking really at, those are the things that formal power needs to do formal power's work. And so I just wanted to highlight that. But Norma, if you could kind of take it there, and then any place else, or ask any questions that have come up for you.
Sure. I'll speak a little bit to the role of potential many roles of other players, and also say something to build on what Gonzalo said about incentives. So, I mean, I think in terms of other players, there's all sorts of levels. One is that we have a program that colleagues of mine manage about transparency, participation, and accountability, and giving citizens data about the delivery of social services that they can then use to advocate for change, including citizen-generated data. So I think that there's a real role for public accountability and public demand. I mean, I think we would all love to be living in countries where there was a public demand for evidence, but also just public accountability around the delivery of social services as part of this ecosystem. I mean, practically, as you alluded to, Beryl, what we do is write checks to organizations that generate evidence and advocate for evidence in smart ways, with ultimately the end being governments, and recognize that it takes a multiplicity of players to have that kind of dialogue, and that can be helpful to champions within governments. Also, I wanted to just speak briefly on the point about incentives. I think that this is a really hard problem, and there are three things that I've learned about this that I think from someone, including from work in our data portfolio. One is what your point about transparency of information. So we have an organization we support called Open Data Watch, which developed a really simple tool to measure the reliability, accessibility, and openness of the data of national statistics offices. With this, when this was public, a lot of people started saying, why is our country ranked 22 out of 100 points. Why are we so far behind others in the region? So there was a little bit of room for dialogue based on transparency. That also provided inroads for champions, which is my second point. I mean, a lot of change happens because of champions within governments, many of whom are in this room, who may not have incentives to make these things happen, but where a little bit of external information and pressure can open up inroads for them to make change within their governments. And then the final thing about incentives is just celebrating success, both having governments do that in the structured way you talked about, but also having civil society do that of government champions who do make a difference. So for example, Ecuador's statistics office got particularly up in arms about their score on this index, about the quality of their statistics. They then totally revamped a couple aspects of their approach, and their score went way up. And Open Data Watch and some of their other partners now hold them up as an example. They go to all sorts of conferences to speak about changing their statistics, which of course provides additional incentives for other folks considering doing the same thing. So those are some of my takeaways.
Sylvia, I'd like, one question came to mind. I love the framework. And I wonder how many others work for organizations that have developed that kind of tool to help use evidence and inform decision making that's accessible staff-wide. Just raise your hands. Exactly. Oh, even. So in South Africa, CONEVAL has a version of it. And then so then here's my question: is there accountability to use the tool? So you said that it's built into the design process, but how much are you able to know about who's using it and to what end? And it's great because there's like an evidence gap map, but are there feedback loops for the learning coming from the programming that, maybe less formal channels of evidence, or is it formally published evidence that gets into the framework?
The evidence that gets into I feel like there are a couple of different questions. The evidence that we actually add into the framework are very rigorous studies. Actually, one of the limitations of the framework is that we don't include individual studies. We only include systematic reviews of rigorous studies that comply with certain causal evidence norms. So that's the evidence. So when we have a team of people from the IRC working on designing a program, they're going to be looking at evidence that that usually comes from very different countries at the same time. And one of the limitations of this is that sometimes there's very little evidence coming from context of conflict and crisis, and so sometimes we need to make we just need to use the best available evidence from sometimes low and middle income countries and then generate our own evidence about what works in our context. But with regard to the question about how the systems, the methods of accountability, what happens is that when we are designing a program, people from different levels of the organization get together. So we're usually working with the people from the country who know about the situation. We are also working with people from headquarters and with the people from the regional offices, and we all get together, and it's like a best practice. We always will go, if we're going to be working on trying to solve one of our a problem in education, we will, with a specific population, we will always revise the theories of change, and we will see what is the outcome that we want to promote. And so we see, okay, if we want to promote this outcome, let's see which one of these things maybe it's actually a barrier for education in this specific context and country, and then try to identify what are the interventions that have worked in other places. So it's almost like a best practice, and we always do it in the process of designing programs. And then, of course, these are, all of those are just theories at this point, theories of change, and so we're trying to generate evidence to see whether the evidence that about what works in other contexts actually works with the specific populations that we work with. And so we conduct these studies, and then we will be updating the theories of change to be able to create the evidence of what works in our own contexts.
Now, the activist girl in the presidency, this is the highest office in the land, right? And in that office, we host the kind of one of the most advanced evaluation systems in the continent. The architecture, all the tools that have been mentioned here are in place. Conduct evaluations and their improvement plans in place. But that girl noticed, particularly for her sector, where a majority of the evaluations concluded in the country actually covers that sector, from agriculture, various programs in the ministry, land reform, restitution, and all that. And realized, you know, at some point, with all the improvement plans done, there's reluctance to take that process forward. The improvement plan is done with tremendous amount of follow-up and push. You'll get a report. But to what extent does that have an impact on the beneficiaries, on the users, and by extension, on society? I think the girl coming as an activist from the rural community is very much concerned about the impact on society. What are the views of the users in this regard? So where evidence is generated and is available for public good, with all the tools that we developed as specialists, if that does not translate into improvements, tangible improvements in society, is that usable evidence? Is that use? I think that is the question. Let me share now, as the person driving this work in the presidency for the sector rural development, that I saw a unique, a positive outlier in the manner in which evidence was used. And that unique experience saw a combination of the results of the evaluations, all other forms of assessments, making that publicly available, but also civil society taking up that role. And this had to do with the national food security status in the country, okay, where civil society actually took up that role, challenged the program managers to involve them with academia in developing a response, an integrated response to a national food security system. And today, I think that is one of the success story that we can point that has transformed or dismantled the fragmentation in the system, compelling various institutions in government, in academia, civil society organizations to work together towards ensuring there's a national food security response to that challenge. I don't know how applicable, how many of you can cite such an example that has translated into tangible impact in society.
Just very, very quickly, in the World Trade Organization, at a time when the TRIPS agreement was protecting Big Pharma's pricing of essential medicines, this intersected with, of course, the pandemic of HIV and AIDS and people dying because the governments and people couldn't afford the medicine. So in WTO, in the system, the first step of implementing the TRIPS agreement was to nationalize the TRIPS in legislation. So if the coalition working to ensure access to essential medicines at an affordable price had simply gathered the evidence and battled Big Pharma through the politicians and tried to argue in parliamentary committees, we would have lost badly. But we hired lawyers to do an analysis of the bill that Big Pharma had helped write very helpfully for the government. And so we had evidence. In our coalition, we had doctors who were treating HIV patients. We had UN representatives running programs. We had media. We recruited op-ed editors from the major newspapers to be willing to take our views on a if the government announced in the morning, we could call and say we can give you 800 words by 4 p.m. and it would get published. And we had people take to the streets. And that was something that has been mentioned, that the politicians would not have paid attention if we had not also had citizen activism and that organized demand and that voice being reflected in that. So we had to have evidence, but it was like the price of admission to be able to go up against Big Pharma and what they were telling everybody about why prices had to be what they were while people were dying. And moral high ground wasn't enough, just to say there are lots of people dying, so you need to fix it. It was this combination. And in combination, we managed at the national level to get progressive legislation that allowed lower prices. That coalition worked at the global level, and we defeated the United States and the EU in combination, and we got the TRIPS agreement modified to protect least developed countries' ability to access affordable medicines. And it was because all those factors at different times at different levels were playing together. So evidence to promote its use is to recognize it's necessary but not sufficient. So that's my story, and it can work, but it takes a lot, and there's a whole lot that you can't control. So we got a bit lucky too. Now, what I'd like to do is, does anybody on the panel have any questions of each other? And then otherwise I'm going to open it up and start bringing in others.
We're talking here about using of evidence. And another story I want to tell you is that in Mexico, when CONEVAL started, we started evaluating budget programs. And we did very well until we realized that that evidence was not enough. We're trying to do even impact evaluations in many of them, and we realized that we needed another type of evidence which complement impact evaluations, which is very important. I'll give you an example. If you can show in Mexico, in a very simple way, that access to social rights is not equal, for instance, if you compare indigenous versus non-indigenous people, you don't need an impact evaluation to show that. But that's perhaps more important than 3 impact evaluations of concrete programs. If you don't combine impact evaluations with the broader picture, then we will be missing the point, because then government is going to fix that specific program, but that will not solve the problem of access to health services to the indigenous people. So you can show that very easily. You can show those elements on the evidence in a broader sense, and we have that evidence to be used as well. Not only the fancy impact evaluation stuff, but the very simple and very easy to understand general evidence that if we don't combine those type of evidence, we are just really misleading governments and parliament.
So I completely agree with you. I would like to add that despite the fact that, for example, IRC's framework is focused like the type of evidence that is linked to the specific tool that I showed comes from impact evaluations and not individual but systematic reviews. We do take into account in like we consider evidence as things that may be not related also to randomized controlled trials, but also implementation research and even client feedback. So that's something that is very important for us as well. And as part of our research agenda, because we're trying to generate evidence, we do the causal inference research, but we do why does something work and for whom does it work, and try to identify the differential effects that that an intervention is having on the different populations that we're working with.
So you're a provider of impact evaluations at ID Insight, and how does this resonate with the approach that you take as a service provider in the evidence production? That the view of what's the provider's role in ensuring that what you produce is used, and how you promote that. If you could just kind of chip that in, and then I'll keep going, and I will take. There's plenty of time for questions.
Great, yeah. So I would say that there are, first, to directly answer the question, at least for ID Insight, and we're essentially an evidence provider. We work in Africa and Asia to provide evidence to policymakers and government, NGOs, and social businesses. So for us, absolutely, if the evidence isn't being used, then what are we doing, essentially? In order to increase the probability that the evidence is used, a lot of what Gonzalo was saying really resonates with me. That, in particular, providing a range of different services and seeing what types of both impact evaluations, but also just descriptive statistics might be useful for the client. For example, we were working with the government of Bihar, the Department of Energy, to help them improve their electricity distribution. And similarly, a lot of what we were doing initially was just showing graphs of which districts within Bihar had different levels of electricity provision. And even that those very basic statistics were something that were useful, but someone in the office might not have had time to find. So that was there. And then the second brief thing that I would say is that, and I would be curious to hear how this resonates with you as well, is that a lot of it for us is identifying a receptive individual within the client's organization. So 80% of the job is probably, well, maybe not 80% of the job is done, but certainly 80% of the probability of affecting a decision might be related to the particular individual who we happen to connect with. And so actually I would be curious in terms of the individuals who you were noting getting calls from, whether it was a set of very technocratically minded people who were calling in and saying, hey, this was really useful for us, or whether also it was a broader range of people who found the information useful beyond what you might have expected. What was the mix there?
Another type of provider, but also I know that you have a country-based program, and I'm very interested in how that might actually help. And Manny has spoken about how 3IE is grappling with this. Do we need to be at country level, and what does that look like? And so in terms of promoting evidence use, briefly, because we are a bit time bad, as they say in Uganda, give us some insights about that experience and what we could do better from that.
Sure. So I'm Heidi from IPA. We absolutely think that kind of in the space, our comparative advantage has been the country presence. And we've seen that now that we've had the long-term relationships that we've now had in these countries over the course of a couple of years. In particular, an example that's recent in my mind, because I was just there, is our relationship with the Minister of Education in Ghana. We've been working with them for, 7 or 8 years now, doing the kinds of things that the ID Insight is talking about, being useful, being helpful, not only providing impact evaluation results, but also providing descriptive data and other things, but also really doing this long-term process of developing the questions together, answering them together, and not just one study at a time, but thinking throughout their system, what are all of the different kinds of questions that they're asking and being useful at different levels. So I think for us that really has been one of the big keys and is a lesson that we're grappling with too, as we think about, okay, so we want to build this local presence, we want to have the policy impact in one particular place, but we also want to make sure that we're using theory to inform this, and doing replications of studies across context, field replications of studies across context, to make sure that we can see how things work in different places. So it's a trade-off that we're really grappling with as well. But for us, the key has been the long-term local presence.
there's a JPAL story, which I'm going to co-opt, in that we funded a study where JPAL did very good work in Haryana, which is close to Delhi, and they invested in one champion, most important person. Okay, they got the right person, and then the person left. Now, we actually, in monitoring our grants, this happens a lot, and we actually have taken steps in 3IE to make sure that when we are giving grants, we work very closely with the grantees to say, you need more than one, okay? Because what ended up happening with the Haryana study is that that person left, there was no ownership, that person kind of held on to the study, it was going to be their little gem, right? And then they abandoned it. Well, the next person had no investment in it, and they just didn't use the study. It just, nothing, sorry, not mine, right? And we thought, well, there's a null uptake, right? We get good results, no uptake. Shoot. Well, there was an NGO, education NGO, that saw those findings, very well connected with JPAL. JPAL, unbeknownst, had another type of champion who then went out and said, you know, this is really a good idea to teach at the right level. Yo, let's see what we can do. So in the end, our funded study findings have been used, and I think they're up to $30 million of new funding. They're rolling it out across 4 states in India. They're trialing it in Africa. Of course, we are happy to feel very proud of that. Having not been involved afterwards, but it's a great story of the pratfalls of single champions and how the use of findings can get translated, can get turned around, can morph into other things, be taken up by others, and we can't always control that. So there's a happy ending there, but the cautionary tale is it might not have happened that way if there weren't a pratham operating in India that is so well connected. So questions for the panelists?
You're using information at a macro level. There are also trials that have actually, and projects that have looked at how to use information at the local level, how to improve the program, for example. Well, I think in Rajasthan, they actually introduced social auditing and social auditing of a big employment program. And that social auditing, and there's been some evaluation of social auditing, I think. And then the Gujarat, there was the JPAL's work on pollution auditing. So in that sense, I think in Gujarat, they actually sort of said that we are going to use the result of your auditing, and that's how it was used up. But the whole idea was that having information available changed the system, and that was a randomized trial, I believe.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. So I think Andhra Pradesh actually introduced some local information and how that actually kind of changes. The studies by I think Thomas Fujiwara in Brazil, for example. How making information available to voters actually changes voting outcome, and so in that sense, and the one in Benin by Wanchakon, I guess. So there are sort of information there is some information as to how information can be used locally. Now, how does it change information at the grand level? That's something that actually may be more political and more political economy oriented, and maybe that's sort of something that maybe you need to have political scientists working with you on that.
Thank you. No, my name is Federico Ortega from CAF. My question was for Gonzalo. So we've I found this very interesting. This idea of the kind of the measurement of your impact. And it's something we've tackled with and worked on, and I'm happy to see some of that we try to measure some of the same things. But I wanted to ask you about how you do this. Is it based more on surveys, on public data, and is it costly? Is it like, how does that go about? That's.
Yeah, so there were a couple of really good examples of kind of using public sticks, if you will, to get people to listen to and use evidence. And we've been thinking a lot about, how do you talk about things that don't work, and how you talk about failures, and how you do that in a way that doesn't make people go running in the opposite direction and never want to work with you again, and never want to think about evidence again. And so I'm just curious if you think that kind of that has to be paired with carrots somehow, whether that's with funding or what it is, and what you think the keys to success just as a comment, I think one of the things we've been thinking about is that when we talk about failures, we need to do it in a way of framing it as a learning and supporting that kind of ongoing learning process. But I'd be curious you all's experiences there.
A quick question for Gonzalo. I would like to know a little bit about CONEVAL and the type of evaluations that you do. It seems that you guys are a very credible evaluation firm. I mean, for the governor of X state in Mexico to call in your office and say, okay, by the way, can you tell me how I can improve things in my region? I think it's a great thing. So I would like to know more about the kind of the credibility and rigor of your evidence, and also, are you the only ones, in the country who can provide that type of evidence? The evidence, because what we've seen, for example, in Africa is that politicians, those at least who are interested in evidence, they get evidence from many sources, and they choose what evidence they're going to use. You may present the most rigorous studies and evidence. They will say, no, we have evidence that contradicts yours. And so there's this fight, between studies and between, who believes in what. And because, again, evidence may be, good and credible to you, but it may not be to some other folks and who are accustomed to other types of evidence.
The reason why I like coming to 3IE over the past 10 years is that in my work in Mexico, I don't have many friends. Because when poverty goes up and when a program is not working, and you have to say that, then you don't get many friends. But we understood at CONEVAL that we've been paid to say that, to say what we see. And when poverty is going down, we say that as well. So I think in our countries, and when I say our countries is Latin American countries, with a history of mistrust, we have to have trust. Otherwise, it's just the same old story for the next 100 years again. So, but the good thing about that is that eventually people listen to you from many parties. And therefore, it is true that various governors come to the office, even the federal government, to ask what is the best way for them to fix the budget in order to prioritize the best programs and strategies to reduce poverty according to the way we measure it. So I think there's a plus in the I don't have friends, but there's a good plus about that. Can I say a little bit about the failure? One little bit about failure. Because evaluations include bad things about programs, usually, because otherwise it's not an evaluation, it's just what we are doing right now is that we're making public the evaluation when the program already has an improvement plan which goes together with evaluation. So if you publish at the same time the findings of evaluation plus the way the program is improving it, then the media is very sad because they don't have a very shiny story to tell. Because already the program knows about the problem and they are fixing it. So instead of going to the first page of the newspaper, it goes to page number 20, which is all right. Not only is all right in terms of the media, but then you have incentives for the program to improve the program due to the evaluation process. So you get two birds on one shot.
Just talking about failures and how are we responding to that. In South Africa, the media space, it's a bit challenging, particularly at this time as we move into, this is an election year for the ruling party, right? But we have a great platform in Parliament that is open to the media. And what happens with all the sensitive evaluations? Actually, the results are presented to cabinet, but we could also, I know for my sector, it knows this too, use the parliamentary structures, the portfolio committees, to actually present the results of these evaluations and what needs to be done, the commitments on the improvement plan. And this is publicized through the media, the television channel. And that kind of puts pressure not only to the implementing ministries, but it raises awareness to the end users, the beneficiaries, what needs to be done by government to deliver on various programs. The second option that I found working in my sector was coupling the evaluations, which are mostly at program level, coupling that with the expenditure reviews with Treasury, because then you can show the gaps or benefits through the performance assessment, but also show the possible savings or wastage, the inefficiencies in terms of the budget allocations. And that is a message that when presented together to the political leadership, it kind of resonates, it finds space. Let me use as an example, land reform is a very contested space in South Africa. I said earlier on, it's actually used for political expediency. During election year, everyone is promised that they will get land, and we forget about it soon after. Now, it's land expropriation without compensation. We have numerous evaluations looking at the implementation programs on land reform, the support programs, the beneficiaries of land reform, the expenditure on restitution over the past 23 years. Now, when politicians speak to seeking to attract voters, saying land reform is going to be resolved, will change policies, then it takes courage where evaluators, sector specialists need to kind of adopt a position of being an activist in a way, with courage to say that which is not desirable, where what people don't want to hear, and show what will be the financial implications long term, whether it's doable or not doable. We've done this for land reform at a point in an environment where even the ministry did not want to provide that information. So we just bypassed that, briefed the deputy president, the executive leader, even in the context where the president himself says we're going to do expropriation, and that information is gaining resonance. It's going to be the base for discussion in the policy conference of the ANC in June. I got that announcement today. So let's build on the expertise of the tools that have been developed within this evaluation discipline. But also let's take a step further and be willing to be activist, to be unpopular in that sense, in the sense of in the interest of seeing change, a significant policy shift that will benefit society.
Thanks, Norma and Silvia and Gonzalo and Tsakani, and to everybody who contributed from the audience. I hope that it's been thought-provoking. It's good to remember that it's hard. Change is hard. Using evidence is hard sometimes, but that clearly we've heard a lot about why it's worthwhile and how it's possible. So thanks so much.